So I did. I went and I jumped on this trampoline for 30 minutes. It was so much fun. I was getting so high up, off the ground. It was awesome. And I get off the trampolines 30 minutes later and I fall over. And I am so dizzy. Like I just am having the worst vertigo. And I just have this screaming tinnitus in my ear. And my right ear, it felt completely plugged up. I was like, I can't hear. My hearing has dropped.
Is that your
And
good ear? Your
that's
good
my
ear
good ear.
changed.
That's my
Wow.
good ear. So my good ear
Okay.
dropped. And I didn't know it at the time. My left ear dropped too, but because there's such a big difference between them, it wasn't registering that anything was wrong in the left.
Welcome to the Hearing Wellness Journey podcast, an exploration of determination, hope, self-discovery, and triumph. We'll share the personal experiences of those that are living with hearing loss and provide a haven for their stories to show others that they are not alone in this journey. Please welcome your hosts, Dr. Dawn Heiman and Lindsey Doherty.
Welcome to this episode of the Hearing Wellness Journey. My name is Dr. Dawn Heiman, and I will be your host. I would like to introduce Dr. Laura Pratesi, who is an audiologist, but she has a story of her own to share about her hearing wellness journey. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Pratesi. Can you please tell us who you are, where you're from, things like that?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me here today. So I'm Laura Pratesi, and I was born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia. And my mom had her master's degree in early childhood education, and my dad was vice president of regional sales for GE Information Services. And we were just a middle-class family that was living and working in Metro Atlanta. And I had a really happy childhood. I have one younger sister. We're 2 years apart in age. I'm the oldest. And I would say it was pretty typical, but I don't know any different. But when I was really little, maybe about 2 years old, my mom noticed that I wasn't quite acting exactly right. And like I said, she had her master's in early childhood. So she was very in tune. And as the first baby, she was really watching me pretty closely. But she noticed that when I would do things like try to talk on the phone with my grandparents, that I would switch from my left ear to my right ear. And so she started setting up all these little like kind of tests to check me. And she really felt like I wasn't hearing correctly. And she brought up her fears to the pediatrician and got blown off. They did a little snap noisemaker test in the office, and they're like, no, she's looking where sounds are from. She's good. But my mom just couldn't shake this feeling that something was really wrong. And when I was about 4 years old, I was in preschool. I was getting ready to go into kindergarten. The preschool offered hearing screenings, vision screenings, speech screenings. And so my mom signed me up for that. And lo and behold, I failed the hearing screening in my left ear. And so she took those results back to the pediatrician and was like, see, something is not right. And so we finally got a referral to an ENT. And the first one we went to did the hearing test and was like, yeah, she's got some hearing loss. We should put a tube in her ear. And my mom was like, does she have fluid? Does she need surgery? And they were like, no, there's no fluid, but we think that'll help. And mom, okay. And I didn't realize that she'd taken me multiple places. I just remember the big one. But so that was the first place that we went. And then the second place that we went, they recommended that they do an MRI or a CAT scan or something. So I remember just being really little and they were having trouble giving me the IV, and I had to go in this big, huge machine, and it was super noisy, and I had to lay very still. And so then afterwards, they sat my parents down and they told them, yep, she has a hearing loss in her left ear. And at the time, we didn't really know of any other family members that had hearing loss other than my dad's mom. who had been diagnosed with otosclerosis back in the 1960s, and she had a failed stapendectomy. And again, they recommended tubes to my parents, and my mom was like, we're not going to have surgery if there's no fluid, if it's not necessary. And so my parents asked him, what about hearing aids? And they told my parents, hearing aids are really noisy. They're going to pick up a lot of sounds like paper crinkling in the classroom, and it'll be really distracting for her. And no, she's got the one good ear, so she'll be fine. As long as she's making A's and B's, don't worry about it. And they let me go. And so from the time I was about 4 or 5 until I was about 8, I would go and I would get annual hearing tests. And then when I was 8, they were like, it's been stable, so you're good. Just call us if anything changes. And they released me from their care. And so I didn't see an audiologist again until I was 18 and I was getting ready to go to college. And I had never had an IEP in school. I never had any kind of accommodations other than preferential seating. Thankfully, because my mom was a teacher, really knew what was going on in the school. She would substitute teach a lot, and she really taught me to advocate for myself. And thankfully, I had my last name at the time was Bradley, and so I was towards the beginning of the alphabet. So they would normally seat us in alphabetical order. So I usually was near the front, and occasionally, because I was a well-behaved girl child, they would try to stick me in the back in between some of the rowdy boys. And I'd be like, no, I can't hear back here. You need to sit me back up front again. So I got really good at standing up for myself with that. But I never really had any accommodations. I never really knew that I could have had accommodations. And at home, I would watch TV with a closed captioning on, and everybody just knew I couldn't hear very well, but that was it. I played in orchestra. I played the cello. I got really involved in choir and then community theater and theater through school. So I ended up being a musical kid, and I was in a lot of those things. Now, it was hard for me to hear harmonies, but thankfully I'm a soprano, so I always got the melody. But I never really knew what I was missing. I struggled a lot with socializing, and particularly like in the lunchroom. I went to a very big high school. We had 4 or 5 different lunch periods. We had 4,000 students in the school. There were about 787 in my graduating class. And we had in middle and elementary school, we had assigned seating at lunch. And somehow I always ended up being sat at the far right end of the table so that my bad ear was facing everyone. And it was really hard for me to communicate in that kind of listening situation. It was the high ceilings and the tile floors, and I would just be exhausted at the end of the day, and I'd be exhausted during lunch. And so I would frequently take a book to read so that I didn't have to bother trying to talk to anybody. And they called my mom in and they were like, we're really worried about her. She reads too much. And my mom was like, are we seriously having this conversation right now? She's like, we struggle so much to get children to read, and you're telling me my kid reads too much. But I understand they were worried I wasn't socializing. And it was really hard for me to socialize, but I needed help. And I just didn't know that I needed help. And I had to take a foreign language in high school. And I remember having the boom box in front of us with the cassette tape in it, and they would press play and we would have to listen to the recording and then write our answers for the tests. And I managed to make good grades in Spanish, but it was certainly very challenging, and it would have been really nice to have some accommodations there. So it really wasn't until I was 18 and I was looking at going to college, and I was nervous about being in a lecture hall with 300 other students that I was like, okay, I really think I may need accommodations. And so we started looking into it. And at the time, Auburn had the Students with Disabilities Department, and they've now changed the name. I think it's called the Office of Accessibility. But so I went to register with the Students with Disabilities office, and they were like, yeah, girl, we're going to need a hearing test that's been performed like in the last decade. So finally went back to the ENT, got back in front of the audiologist again, and they tested me, and my test results looked pretty much the same as they did when I was 5. And they couldn't believe it. They were like, oh my gosh, have you been going this whole time without a hearing aid? And I was like, yeah. And they said, do you want one? And I was like, do I need one? And they went, probably not. You've been getting by. You've got the one good ear. You're fine. And I was like, okay. They were the experts. I didn't know any different. And they didn't offer to let me listen to one or see what I think or try one, nothing. So I just assumed I'm deaf in my left ear and there's nothing we can do about that.
What year is this? What was the technology like back then? Let's just, you and I together as audiologists, try to
Sure.
figure this out. What year were you a freshman at Auburn?
So I graduated high school in 2005. And so I was
the
born
technology wasn't terrible.
No, it wasn't. So I was born in 87. So there was no newborn hearing screening back then. I was one of the first babies that even had a sonogram at Piedmont Hospital. So no newborn hearing screenings to catch me. So that's why I wasn't identified until so late in the game. And then, yeah, it was 2005. So we had decent tech, we had feedback reduction and other stuff like that. So I have no idea what their justification for that was. But like I said, they said it would make things loud, but not clear. It would distract me. And again, I just assumed, okay, deaf in my left ear. I don't know any difference.
They did your hearing test, and then it was just agreed upon that you will always sit at the front of the university classroom lecture halls. Is that what it was summed up to?
So when I met with the Office of Accessibility, that's when they first started saying, oh, if they're showing a movie in class, then it needs to have closed captions for you. And I was like, oh yeah, I use captions at home. That would be great. And then they were like, would you like a note taker? And I was like, that's a thing? And they were like, do you need more time on standardized tests? And I was like, I would like for them to be able to repeat the instructions, because I would always get anxiety because they'd be like, okay, we're only going to say this once. And so listen carefully. And these are the instructions and we can't repeat them again. And I'd always be like, oh God, what if I miss what they're saying? But it never occurred to me that, like, oh, you can make this easier for me. You can accommodate me. That just wasn't.
And in their mind, you're not getting in trouble, you're making grades, you're a good kid, and you're not a complainer. So therefore, you must not need accommodations. Yep. Like maybe up till college, where suddenly they're like, hey, you have the right to have these things.
That was the first time I realized that I had rights, and that, like, I hadn't heard of ADA. It existed, but I didn't realize that it applied to me, that there were, and like my mom knew a little bit of sign language because she had like a great aunt that married into the family, and so she learned finger spelling and some things like that. We always had our little way of communicating across rooms and things, but I wasn't fluent in sign by any means. And they never gave us my differential diagnoses. They never said, this is what caused your loss. It was always just kind of, that's the way God made you. And I was like, oh, okay, that's just how I'm made, I guess. Doesn't change anything. I didn't realize how wrong that was until I became an audiologist myself. So went into undergrad. I actually had a theater scholarship to Auburn. I was a musical theater and opera major, and I got really interested in the idea of music therapy. So because my mom was a teacher, she just really valued education and raised us to value education. And I wanted to be an actress. I was going to like move to New York City and just work on Broadway. And she was like, okay, but what are you going to do to make money while you're doing that? And I didn't want to be a waitress for forever. And so I got the idea that music therapy would be really a cool job, a cool gig. And Auburn didn't have that program, but I knew that I'd have to get my master's in that. So I'd go somewhere else for that anyway. And so that's why I was thinking of double majoring in music and theater for my undergrad degree. And while I was doing that, I took some classes for speech therapy and thought that was pretty interesting and would probably be a good foundation for going to grad school for music therapy. And so I ended up switching my major to communication disorders and took a lot of like psychology, a lot of rehab and special ed, human development and family studies, and finally took my first audiology class, Audiology 101. And not only did I make an A in the class, I got a 100 in the class, and I loved it. And the professor was just kind of, don't do speech, come to the dark side, join audiology. And I was like, yeah, I really like this. This is so interesting. I finally understand what this graph that I've been looking at my whole life means. And I got really passionate about it and became a guinea pig for my classmates because I had the normal hearing in one ear and the hearing loss in the other. And my hearing loss is mixed. So I have a conductive component in the low frequencies, and then it switches to sensorineural in the high frequencies. So the professors thought it was great because I was a perfect example of all the different kinds of hearing losses someone could have. And my classmates hated it because they had to do so much masking, and it was so hard to test me because I was like, I've got tinnitus. I don't know. Is that the beep? And so I ended up switching my major to audiology and putting in my grad school application, and I got accepted to Auburn's program and was offered a graduate teaching assistantship, which was great because the out-of-state fees were killer. And
I think it's, excuse me, but I think it's cool that even in your undergraduate, before you found that audiology class, that you were gravitating towards classes that maybe, in my mind, could have helped you way in the past. Like, you're fascinated by it, special education and psychology and looking at special needs cases and things like that. That was obviously something that was intriguing to you, saying, oh, isn't that interesting? And then even more so to then land in exactly where you've been struggling for years to try to understand what is going on with the way that I hear.
Yeah, absolutely.
So cool.
It was all these audiology adjacent classes. And yeah, but I just took to it like a fish to water. And I was so excited because it was finally making sense to me. I was reading the textbooks about kids with hearing loss and how they have auditory fatigue and how they're more kinetic and visual learners and how they are just really tired and grumpy at the end of the day because their mental load is so much higher. And I was like, did they write this about me?
I know. You're like, this is me. Thank you, somebody, for hearing me.
Yeah. I mean, it was like it just unlocked something, and I was like, I swear they followed me around and then wrote this textbook based on how I was functioning. But I was like, oh, I'm just like every other kid with hearing loss, and I just didn't know it.
You didn't know it, and it's not your fault. It's not your mom's fault. It's not that anyone did. And even the in 2005 was about the time that I think Children's Hospital of Philadelphia was submitting papers showing why we need to aid a child who has a unilateral hearing loss. They had done some studies with kids who have varying degrees of hearing loss in one ear, and then showing that if there is aidable hearing, please fit this child with a hearing aid. If it is unaidable, if it's like severe to profound, then let it go or talk about a cochlear implant. But that was right around that time that you were in high school by that point. So prior to that, audiologists were like, just tell them it's good enough. Thank goodness you have a good ear. So now you're learning all this stuff. At what point did you start saying, can I try a hearing aid? Can I fit myself? Can I let my classmates try something on? Like, at what point did you continue to struggle and finally say, hey, can we try to help me?
It was like my first week of grad school. We were all in the clinic, and we had one of the reps from one of the hearing aid manufacturers was there, and she was talking about fitting patients in theory. And I was like, well, if you want a guinea pig, you can fit me. And she was like, you have a hearing loss? And I was like, yeah. And so they threw me in the booth and tested me and then fit me with a hearing aid right then and there. And I just cried. The sound quality difference for me, it was like I had been underwater my whole life. You know, how it's muffled, it's distorted, you can hear sounds, but it's so quiet. And then suddenly it was sharp and it was clear and it was tinny and hissy. And I was like, oh my gosh, I'm being like stabbed in the ear with sound. This is amazing. I didn't know there was anything viable there. And this is what it could have sounded like. Automatically, I was just blown away. And
what was the hearing aid in 2005?
It was a Resound Dot 30.
Ooh, so it was a cute one.
The really cute one. I got it with a hot pink case, and oh my gosh, I loved it. I thought it was the best thing ever. And I got that bright color because I was like, I wanted to draw attention to it. I wanted people to see it and ask me about it. And I had really short hair at the time. So I was like, yeah, everybody's going to see this. No one noticed. Like I had to show people.
Wah, wah.
Yeah.
You're like, what a disappointment.
It
No one
was.
notices my hearing aid. I want them to see it.
Right. And for the first time, I finally realized that my dad was really embarrassingly loud. Like my whole life, my mom had been like, oh my gosh, your father, he's so loud. He draws attention everywhere we go. I'm like, he's the only one I can hear and understand. And that first weekend, I went home with my new hearing aid and I was like, oh my gosh, what are you doing? I was like, you are shouting. And my mom was like, you finally know what I'm talking about. And I was like, yeah, okay, I get it. So I had to go back to the clinic and be like, all right, we're going to turn down the MPO and the loud sounds because I can't take my dad's voice.
Case in point. So did
Yeah.
you find that you had less auditory fatigue when you would sit in lectures? Or
So
honestly, the content got harder?
yes and no. So the first few weeks, it was harder. I was more fatigued because I was just being bombarded by so much auditory information that I wasn't used to handling. So that was interesting, but then it got easier over time. But it really took, I remember distinctly like coming home to my duplex that I shared with my sister when I was in grad school and being like, what is that noise? And she was like, the refrigerator. And I was like, does it always sound like that? And she was like, yeah. But I'd never heard it humming. And then there was this click, click. And I was like, what is that? And she was like, it's the clock. And I was like, is it always that loud? And she was like, yeah, but you just ignore it. But it was about 2 weeks, 3 weeks after getting the aid that I came home and I threw my bag down and I started working on my laptop. And then I was like, the refrigerator's not working. I don't hear it humming anymore. And so I went out and I listened and I was like, okay, no, it's there. Okay, it's still just as loud as it was, but my brain had gotten used to it being in the background and I just started tuning it out. And so I was like, this is so rad. I can't believe it. And one of the cool things was the professors at the time, they were like, okay, look, you can keep this hearing aid, but in exchange, you have to document everything. So I did. I kept a journal. And as unfortunate as it was that I went so long unaided, I think it was a blessing and a curse because I was older when I was fit. I really remember that process. And because I had to document it's all so clear in my mind. And so with every patient that I fit with a hearing aid, I'm able to be like, okay, I remember it sounding like that. I remember it being loud, weird, echoey. My voice sounded strange, but it gets better. I promise. You just have to stick with it. And so I feel like I've been really good at guiding people through that process because I so distinctly remember it. Versus if I had been fit when I was 5, I might not have held on to those little details. So my weakness became my superpower in a way.
Absolutely. And you might not have been pulled into this field because you were seeking something that you didn't even realize was accomplishable. Is that a word?
Yeah.
And it's amazing how our journeys take us along and we don't know why we're put on this earth for a certain reason, but obviously you're helping a lot of people. And now you are an audiologist, you're wearing hearing aids. Did anything change at any point? Did you ever have an aha moment that, wait a minute, something's different, I'm not really sure what's going on? After graduate school and you start working, has your hearing changed at all?
Yeah, I was working at a primary care physician's office a few years ago. I guess it was 2016, 2017. And we had a team building exercise, which are great. Like you go to an escape room, you go to lunch, like just really get to know each other. And we went to Sky Zone, which is like this trampoline park. And so I had never jumped on a trampoline. In addition to my hearing loss, I have a completely unrelated heart condition that I have a pacemaker for. And I never really did sports as a kid or anything that could get my heart rate up. And my mom was like, oh, don't jump on the trampoline. It's too hard. I was like, Mom, I'm an adult now. I can tell if like my heart's getting out of rhythm or if I'm getting fatigued or whatever. It's like, it'll be fine. So I did. I went and I jumped on this trampoline for 30 minutes. It was so much fun. I was getting so high up, off the ground. It was awesome. And I get off the trampolines 30 minutes later and I fall over. And I am so dizzy. Like I just am having the worst vertigo. And I just have this screaming tinnitus in my ear. And my right ear, it felt completely plugged up. I was like, I can't hear. My hearing has dropped.
Is that your good ear?
That's
Your
my
good ear
good ear.
changed.
That's my
Wow.
good ear. So my good ear
Okay.
dropped. And I didn't know it at the time. My left ear dropped too, but because there's such a big difference between them, it wasn't registering that anything was wrong in the left. But I had always had perfect hearing in my right ear. I had otoacoustic emissions out through 15,000 hertz. Like it was beautiful. I was at 0. And then suddenly I was like, I can't hear anything. And he's 5 years old now, but my son was a toddler at the time. He had this little like shaky egg that he would play with, and he was shaking the egg. And I was like, I can't hear the egg. I don't hear the sand in it. And so I panicked, and it was a weekend, but I called a primary care doctor who was a friend of mine. I was like, you've got to put me on steroids right now. I've got a sudden hearing loss. And I'd seen a couple cases in the clinic in the past couple of weeks. And so I really thought I had contracted a virus that must have attacked my organ for hearing. And so I was like, steroids, that's what I've got to get. So I started taking the oral steroids. And then first thing on like that Monday morning, I went into an otologist. It was Tampa Bay Hearing and Balance, Dr. Kyle Allen. That was who I went to see. Love them. Love that man. So they did transtympanic steroid injections. First, they put me in the booth and they saw that, yes, my hearing had dropped pretty significantly in both ears. So I lost all my hearing basically above 3,000 hertz in my right ear. And my left ear had dropped as well. And my speech understanding scores had dropped from like the 90th percentile down to the 80th percentile. And so they started doing transtympanic steroid injections. So they did the first injection. And it sounds awful, right? You're like, oh my gosh, a shot in the eardrum. It is not as awful and bad as it sounds. It's not fun, but like, it's not as bad as it sounds. And they did that. And then they sent me to go get a CT scan. And so I got this high resolution CT scan. And then they were like, okay, we're going to bring you back the next day. We're going to do another shot. We're going to read the results. And I was like, okay. So I was driving from Claremont to Tampa, which is like an hour and 45 minutes away. So I did that for 2 or 3 days in a row. And when they got the CT results back, they sat me down and they were like, has anyone ever told you that you have a Mondini malformation? And I was like, I don't have Pindred syndrome. What are you talking about? And they were like, no, Mondini's can occur in Pindred syndrome or independently. This can be like a random birth defect, or it can be an inherited genetic thing, or it can be associated with this syndrome. And so then they started asking me all these questions about it.
For those listening that don't know what a Mondini malformation is, would you like to explain to them what part of the ear we're talking about and what they were looking at?
Yeah, absolutely. So I had not even read about it since like grad school. So it was far out of my mind too. But so we're talking about the inner ear, and there's 2 parts to a Mondini malformation. The first part is you have a cochlear malformation. So the cochlea is the snail-shaped organ for hearing, and it is supposed to be 2.5 rotations. Mine is only 1 rotation. So because my cochlea is malformed, that's part 1. The second part is EVA, or enlarged vestibular aqueduct, and that affects more the organ for balance in the inner ear. And so you can have EVA on its own, you can have cochlear malformations on their own, but when you have the 2 things together, that's what makes it a Mondini's malformation. And like I said, it's most commonly found in patients that have Pindred syndrome, but EVA is actually one of the biggest reasons why kids are born with non-syndromic hearing loss. So if you diagnose hearing loss in a child, there's a good chance that like it could potentially be EVA, and it needs to be ruled out.
And then when I worked at a children's hospital, the kiddos who had enlarged vestibular aqueduct syndrome, they would come in as emergency cases because they hit their head in swim lessons or they hit their head doing whatnot. Do you think that jumping on the trampoline
Oh, 100%.
led to this
100%.
diagnosis? Yeah.
Yeah, they told me basically anything that can change your inner thoracic pressure can harm your hearing when you have EVA. And they said skydiving, scuba diving. They were like, if you're constipated and strain too hard when you poo, they were like, anything like that. And they said, so don't go jumping on any trampolines. And I said, well, that's what I did. And they were like, oh, seriously? And I was like, yes, because nobody's ever told me that I had this condition.
Why would you do anything different? So did the
Right.
hearing come back? Did the transtympanic shots help?
They did not help, unfortunately, and my hearing stayed down. And so since that time, I have now become a bilateral hearing aid user, and I do notice a lot more fluctuations in my hearing than I used to. So sometimes 3,000 hertz is within normal limits, and sometimes it's down at a mild or moderate loss. And so that happens a lot in my right ear. Even my left ear, I am more in tune to when I'm having bad hearing days. And I've worn a lot of hearing aids ever since I got fit with that old dot 30. But now what I currently wear is the Widex Evokes because I love the app because it's got the tuning ability in there. Yep. And so I can up my bass and my mids and my treble. So on a bad hearing day, I can go in and just adjust it without having to formally hook myself up to the computer and reprogram my aids because it might be, okay, I've got a cold and so everything's dropped now and then it'll be back in a week and now everything's too loud. And so the app just lets me tune it for what I need for that day.
That's so cool. Most people have to go in to see their audiologist to make an adjustment, but what if the hearing changes tomorrow or they make the appointment, by the time you have the appointment, something's changed. So even as the audiologist, you're not even running to the office to get the programming that you could do. You're just doing it on the fly on your cell phone.
Yep.
Through an
I
app.
mean,
Isn't that
yeah.
cool?
And so whenever I have a patient now that has fluctuating hearing loss, like patients with Meniere's disease or something like that, then that's one of the things that I really look at. And okay, what manufacturer are we going to fit them with? I want to fit them with a manufacturer where they can maybe make some of these fine tuning adjustments on their own so that they don't have to run in, or getting them something where I can do telehealth and remote programming so that they don't have to formally come in and we can just adjust it on the fly a little bit. Because with fluctuating losses, you're trying to hit a moving target. And what's perfect on one day by day 3 or 6, like you might not need the same exact settings.
Yeah, that's so cool. And now you and I know each other pretty well because we're in a mastermind together. And I know this, so I'm going to share with everyone else. But you have your own private practice now. What made you decide to go out on a limb and say, you know what, I think I'm going to establish my own entity and hang my shingle on the door?
It was definitely a God thing. I was not happy where I was. I really wasn't feeling like I was fulfilling my purpose. And I did not want to start a private practice. I did not want that. And I knew how much work it was going to be. And I was like, no. And yet, doors just kept opening in that direction. And until it became so obvious that it was like I'd been swallowed by the whale, it was like, no, this is what you're supposed to do. And so I ended up not having a job and I was trying to figure out what to do. And I just looked around and there just wasn't any job openings at the kind of practice that I wanted to work at. And then that made me think, oh, I'm not finding the kind of practice that I'm wanting to work at. Maybe that's because it doesn't exist. Maybe I'm supposed to start it. And I had a little kid. I didn't want to drive more than an hour away for work. And there wasn't anything local. And I was like, wait a minute, there's not anything local. Who's helping the people that live here in my own backyard? And so I was like, oh, there's a need here. And so we moved into our space on April 1st, 2018, because April Fool's Day is a great day to start a business. And we're still going strong. So we've got about 1,600 patients in the system now that have come that we've helped, and it's amazing. I love it. I'm constantly amazed at what a difference we make. And I'm a big believer in audiologists doing their full scope of practice. I think that we can be experts in all the things hearing imbalance related. And I think that we can be experts at multiple, if not all, the hearing aid manufacturers. If you know how a hearing aid works, then you can figure out the software. And I am a really big advocate for best practices. I was someone who fell through the cracks a lot along the way because there were some best practices not being used. And I'm a really big believer in trying to help patients find their differential diagnoses, because sure, at the end of the day, maybe you still have hearing loss, maybe we're still going to treat you with a hearing aid, but there might be other things that you need to know about your condition. There might be other things you could be doing that are exacerbating the problem, or things you should avoid doing. I don't think I need to live in a bubble. I know that I'm one car wreck and head trauma away from losing my hearing, but at the same time, like I can't live thinking that way. I'm just going to take it one day at a time. And having this drop, it again put me in the patient's shoes. There had been so many patients that I had referred on callously to get shots in their ears. And I was like, look, if that's what you got to do, it's what you got to do. And then when it came time for me to get it done, I was like, no, I don't want to. But then I got through it. And now I can be like, okay, I've had this done. And yeah, I don't think you have to have hearing loss to be a good audiologist. I know mine has made me a better one. And I mean, if for no other reason that I was like, oh, I have a progressive hearing loss. My hearing could stay stable for years, or it could drop suddenly. It could be there. I can't get it back. What do I do? And they said a lot of kids with EVA end up with cochlear implants. And I was like, I haven't touched a cochlear implant since grad school. I was like, well, guess that's the next thing I'm going to learn about. And now we've been offering cochlear implant services at my clinic for the past 3 years, and it's amazing. And I love it. And it was this part of audiology that I really hadn't had an opportunity to explore a whole lot.
And no one was doing it around you. People had to
No,
travel for hours to go see a specialist.
I have patients here that were driving to Jacksonville, that were driving to Miami.
And you're in Central Florida, right? Did
I
you
am
say
just
Claremont?
I'm just west of Orlando. So there are implanting physicians about 45 minutes away in Orlando. There's a couple practices that are probably about 35 miles from here where you could get mapped. But I was seeing patients that had gone 2 or 3 years without getting their implants looked at because they were like, it's such a burden to travel. It's so hard to get to my mapping audiologist. And I was like, if you still want to go there for your annual stuff or whatever, do that. But please call me if you're having an emergency, because I'm right here, and I'd be happy to troubleshoot and repair or whatever to keep you online on the air. I know how hard it is to go a day without my hearing aids. I tried some of the rechargeable hearing aids not that long ago, and I've got 4 cats, and they chewed through my charging cord. And so
Oh my
I
gosh.
was like, oh, you little stinkers. And so I had to go like the weekend without my hearing aids, because I was like, okay, I guess I'm going back to batteries, because I don't want that to happen again.
Is there anything that you would like everyone who's listening to remember as we finish up this podcast today?
That is a good question. I think that one of the biggest things to remember is that there's hope. There's solutions. There are things that we can do. I went so many years just thinking this just is how it is, and there's just nothing that can be better. And I think about all these things that I have now. Like I have an iWatch, and it alerts me when there's sounds nearby, and it alerts me when my doorbell is going off, because I don't normally hear the doorbell. And now I've got the Dot didn't have streaming, but now the Evokes, they can stream from my iPhone directly. And I've got the captioning app on my phone, and I've got Telecoil, and I know what CART is, and when oh gosh, I forget what it stands. It's like captioning something real time. And I request that when I go to conferences now. And there are things that we can do. There are ways to communicate. There are ways to be connected, whether it's using signed languages and manual communication, whether it's upgrading your hearing aids to CIs. Like we have ways to keep you connected to other people. And if you're not doing well with what you've got, don't just be satisfied with the status quo. Seek out answers. Try to find providers that follow best practices. And because the person doing the programming makes such a huge difference. You can have this Cadillac technology, but if it's not programmed appropriately, you can be doing poorly with it. My life and what I need, it's so much more than just sticking my hearing aid in my ear every morning. Like there are a lot of little technologies and things that I use throughout my day that make my life better, that improve my quality of life, that help me. And because I use them, I'm able to talk with patients about them. And
you're doing it. How can people find you if they live in Central Florida or they tend to go there as snowbirds? What is the name of your practice?
It's Citrus Hearing Clinic. We are very close to the Citrus Tower, which is a very famous little local landmark here in Lake County. And so we're Citrus Hearing Clinic, and we are all over the web. We've got our website, www.citrushearing.com. You can request appointments through the website if talking on the phone is not your strong suit, as some of us we're not great at.
For sure. And we're going to put the link on the webpage so you can just click on it. Thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate you. I really appreciate you sharing your story, because I know it's hard to get up in front of a camera, to tell your story, to be vulnerable, let people know what really happened in your life. This is not easy. So I appreciate people like you, Dr.
For sure. Thank you so much for having me. I absolutely love you. I love what you're doing. So thank you.
Thank you. I am blessed to have you in my circle. People like you make me smile, and you lift me up and challenge me all the time, especially when it comes to best practices. Dr. Pratesi is like number one. Thank you all for listening, and we will catch you next week. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Hearing Wellness Journey podcast. For more information about what we do and the services we provide, please visit our website at hearingwellnessjourney.com/podcast, where you can find more resources based on today's discussion, as well as request to be a member of our Hearing Wellness Journey community on Facebook. That's available for our listeners exclusively on hearingwellnessjourney.com/podcast.